Hello, I'm Sophie Anderson, the author of The House with Chicken Legs, The Girl Who Speaks Bear, and The Castle of Tangled Magic. And today I'm going to talk mostly about my inspiration for The Girl Who Speaks Bear, which is a fun fairy tale adventure about identity and belonging. And I thought I'd begin by reading a very short extract. This is from the prologue, so the very beginning of the book. I remember the bear who raised me, nuzzling my face into her warm belly, huge furry limbs shielding me from the biting snow. I remember the deep rumbles of her snores through the silent winter and clouds of steamy breath smelling of berries and pine nuts. My foster mother, Mamochka, says I was about 2 years old when she found me outside the bear cave. She says I was standing naked in the snow, but with warm pink cheeks and the biggest smile. I walked right up to her, lifted my arms into the air and made a soft barking sound. Mamochka picked me up and I laid my head on her shoulder, wrapped my legs around her waist and fell straight to sleep. Mamochka says, she knew right there and then we were meant to be together. But if I don't know where I came from, how can I be sure where I belong? Mamochka looked in the cave for clues about who I was or who my parents might be, but an old female bear was hibernating inside. Not wanting to disturb her, Mamochka crept away and carried me to her home at the edge of the snow forest. I love living with Mamochka. She's the best mother I could have wished for, but I often wonder about the bear. I wonder if she remembers me, maybe even misses me. I wonder about the bear almost as much as I wonder about my real parents, the ones who must have lost me or left me in the forest. One day I'd like to find the story of my past, and I hope it's something more magical than being unwanted and abandoned as a baby. I hope it's a tale filled with wonder that explains who I am and why I'm different, why I hear the trees whispering secrets, and why I always feel the forest pulling me in. So The Girl Who Speaks Bear is about a girl called Ivanko who was found in a bear cave as a baby. She's grown much bigger and stronger than anyone else in her village she lives in now, and she doesn't feel like she fits in. When something happens to her, she decides that she must go into the forest to discover the secrets of her past and find out where she truly belongs. Along the way to help her, she meets a cast of talking animals, and there are also 12 fairy stories in the book that are woven. If I find one. So the fairy stories, they sort of have this border and they're in between chapters. And so they're separate, but they're also woven into the main narrative, and they help guide Ivanko on her journey. So the book and all the short fairy stories in it were all inspired by Russian and Slavic folk and fairy stories. And those are all stories that I heard growing up from my grandmother, who was Prussian, but who moved to Pontypridd in South Wales after the Second World War. So most of the stories that she told me, she just told me orally. She remembered them from when she was growing up, but you can obviously find lots of these Russian fairy stories in Russian fairy story books, like this rather beautiful old one that someone gave me a copy of. So I remembered the stories from when I was young, but I've also done quite a lot of research into these stories since. I do really love these stories. In particular, for The Girl Who Speaks Bear, it was, of course, stories that included bears that inspired me. There are lots of stories involving bears in Russian folklore. I found quite a lot of intriguing ones in this book. And there was one story in particular that really captured my imagination, and that was the story of Ivanko, the bear's son. Now, Ivanko is a character who was a bear from the waist down and a human from the waist up, and he had immense strength. I have a picture. This is from a woodcut, which is a sort of art carved in wood, and this is from 1494, so it's very old. And I think it shows Ivanko, the bear's son, who's a bear from the waist down. and a human from the waist up. And his story is a little bit of an odd folk story. It's what we call the fool triumph story. And it wasn't so much his story that inspired my book, The Girl Who Speaks Bear, but his character, this idea of being part one thing and part something else, or perhaps part wild and part domesticated. And it's quite a common theme in folklore and fairy tales, I think, this idea of being two things at once. And it was this feature that inspired the main character of Yanka in The Girl Who Speaks Bear. And it led to her story as well, because once I knew I was working with a character who was going to have human and bear characteristics, I knew that she was going to be a character who wasn't quite sure who or what she was. So she would need to go on a journey of self-discovery, which is where story comes in. I think all books, you need to have a main character who wants something. And for Yanka, it was going to be she wants to find out who she is, you know, where she came from and who she is now and who she is going to be. So it's that journey of self-discovery. I knew that journey would be into a forest, because she has these bear characteristics, and of course bears live in forests, but also just because forests and the outdoors in general, they are places of adventure and discovery. And having this setting, this outdoor setting, this vast forest, I knew it was going to be really fun to work with that setting. I would be able to include some really fun animal characters, some hopefully beautiful descriptions of nature, and have all of those sorts of adventurous outdoor elements, along with sort of forest fairy tale elements, that, you know, the magical elements, and which overlaps with nature, because I truly think nature is magical. You know, there's this link. So basically, yes, nature, the outdoors, wildlife and landscapes, they've always massively inspired me in my writing. And with all my books, I love including these things. And I think one of the most enjoyable things about writing The Girl Who Speaks Bear was researching the outdoor settings and the animals that I included and thinking up ways to describe them. Right, another thing that was really enjoyable about writing The Girl Who Speaks Bear was the little between chapter fairy stories. And I didn't actually set out to do that. When I started writing the book, characters just started telling these stories. It was quite unplanned. But it was clear to me that those stories were all inspired, or they were retellings of stories from Russian folklore that I had heard growing up. And they all acted as a guide for Yanka, these stories did. They were like clues to her past. And that's kind of how I feel about fairy stories. I feel that they have always acted as a guide for me. And they're also clues about my past and my heritage. So some of the fairy stories that I reworked in The Girl Who Speaks Bear. So, of course, I've shown you Ivanko the bear's son. There's another fairy story called The Lime Tree's Curse, or sometimes a very similar story is called Why Bears' Paws Are Like Hands. This drawing is by Leonard Horton in 1972, who wrote a version of that story, The Lime Tree. And there's a version of that in The Girl Who Speaks Bear. This fierce lady is Nastasia Korolovichna, and painted by someone called Sergei Solomno. And she's thought to be a real person existing in about the year 1000. So a long time ago, and she's thought to be a Lithuanian princess warrior, and there are some fabulous stories about her. She was very adept at archery and at fighting, and she inspired a couple of stories in The Girl Who Speaks Bear, called The Princess Nastasia. And I have The Princess Nastasia. There's a story about her fighting a dragon with 3 heads, who I call Smay in my book, but he's based on a dragon from Russian folklore called Zmei Gorich. And this is a drawing of him from Ivan Bilibin. So the 3-headed dragon is quite a common feature in Slavic fairy stories, so I borrowed that for my book. I also wrote a story about this guy who is Koshi the Deathless. I think I called him the Giant Deathless in my book. This drawing is by Alexiev, and he's a fascinating character from Russian folklore who he doesn't have a soul because he hid his soul so that he could be immortal. I find him fascinating, so I included a couple of stories about him. I also included a story about Morozko, who's a kind of Father Frost character from Russian folklore. This painting is by Nicholas Roerich. So I borrowed Father Frost. I also wrote a story about a flying ship, which again is something that occurs in Russian folklore. This picture is by Yuri Shelevich in 1968. And of course, there's the House with Chicken Legs as well, and Baba Yaga, who are characters from my first book, but also characters from Russian folklore, and they reappear in my second book, although it's not a sequel. But basically, I've included in The Girl Who Speaks Bear lots of inspiration from Russian folklore. I've borrowed lots of characters from old Russian stories and retold stories in my own way and linked them all together to help Yanka on her journey of self-discovery through the forest. So I think folk and fairy stories, I think they're so important culturally. I think they link us to our ancestors, and they also contain the wisdom of our ancestors. I think they really can. A lot of them are strange stories, but they really make you think and learn. And I think that they can help us navigate life. A lot of these stories are thousands and thousands of years old, and I think they have survived for so long because they do speak of a kind of universal human experience that connects us all through time and space. So I think it's really important that these sorts of stories are kept alive. And one of the ways to keep them alive is obviously to keep telling them and retelling them so that they are relevant to readers today. Because yes, I think it would be a shame if these stories are lost. So I do love to work with these stories. And one of my favourite things about The Girl Who Speaks Bear is that it contains some of these stories. And I hope perhaps that some people who read the book might be inspired to go off and find some of the original versions, not necessarily of those Russian stories, but any sort of old myths or legends, ones from Wales or England or Scotland or wherever your ancestors might be from, or just a country that you're interested in. I love folklore from all over the world, and I really hope that my book inspires people to go and seek out some old stories and possibly even reimagine and retell them themselves for today's audience. So there are just a couple more inspirations that I want to mention for The Girl Who Speaks Bear. There's a character called Mamochka, who is Yanka's foster mother, and she was actually inspired by this book, which is called Russian Folk Medicine, which is just a book that contains lots of herbal remedies from the old days. I'll just read you one that's quite interesting. This is a cure for arthritis. The font's very small. So, many folk medicine practitioners considered this therapy superior to all others for treatment of local arthritis. A loose canvas bag was made fitting the affected member, a leg or arm. No two limbs were ever treated simultaneously. The patient's arm or leg was placed into the bag, and then the bag was filled with the contents of an anthill, including the insects, and tied in such a way that they could not escape. The ant bites had to be endured. That was an important part of the treatment. Each treatment lasted for at least 12 hours and often for up to 2 days. So that's live ant therapy for arthritis. But this book has loads of strange and wondrous remedies. They're not all as strange as that, but it has lots of herbs and things like that being used to cure various ailments. And I really wanted Mamochka, the character of Mamochka, to be a kind of old folk healer that used all of these remedies. And all of these remedies, of course, come from nature. So again, it kind of it all links with the themes in The Girl Who Speaks Fair of our connection to nature in various ways. Ivanko is connected to the forest because she was found in a bear cave and she has these bear characteristics. Mamochka, even though she doesn't particularly want Ivanko to go into the forest, she has a deep connection to the forest because she gets all of her cures and remedies from there. And there's this feeling that nature and the forest it's not just a place of adventure and discovery, but also a place of healing. So we can get healing remedies from it, but also by going into the forest, Ivanko is looking for a kind of cure to her inner turmoil, I suppose. So it all links with this idea, basically, of the forest and nature being a place of sanctuary and healing and discovery. Right. Okay, yeah, so the snow forest, it wasn't an entirely made up place. It is obviously a forest like many others, but it was very much inspired by a real forest, a huge forest, one of the biggest forests on Earth, which is called the Russian or the Siberian tiger. And I haven't been there myself, so I did a lot of research into this forest just on the internet and reading a lot of books. And I also watched, there's a fabulous documentary. This is the cover for the documentary. It's called Happy People, A Year in the Tiger. And it's about people who live in a small village, the village of Bakhta, in the Siberian tiger, and some of them actually spend a lot of time living actually in the forest as well. And it's a wonderful documentary, and it really made me feel like I was visiting the forest from the comfort of my own home, and hearing the people talk about how they live with the forest and in the forest was very inspiring. And so that documentary and that forest inspired the setting, but also the people in that documentary also inspired some of the people. There's actually a real life man called Anatoly that you see in this documentary, and he's as kind of a hunter-gatherer, and he very much inspired the character of Anatoly. I didn't even change his name in the book, who's also a hunter-gatherer who spends a great deal of time in the forest. So that was the setting. Also, a few of the characters. Also, there's lots of animal characters in The Girl Who Speaks Bear. Obviously, the bear characters are inspired by brown bears in particular, who I have been lucky enough to observe, although in Canada, not in Russia. There's a character. Let's see if we can focus it. This is a fish owl. And the type of fish owl, it actually lives in Russia, and it's called Blackiston's fish owl. And there's a man called Jonathan Slaught who does a lot of work with these fish owls called Blackiston's fish owl. And I read a lovely book and articles that he'd written about these owls, and they're beautiful owls. And so I wanted to include one of those in my book. And I actually called the owl Blackiston, so again, quite a lazy name. So fish owls inspired the character of Blackiston. There are other animals in The Girl Who Speaks Bear, like elks and wolves. So I just did a lot of research about these animals and included these characters. Possibly my favourite character is a weasel called Mousetrap. Now, I particularly like Mousetrap the Weasel because he is inspired by a real weasel called Mousetrap, who does actually live under my floorboards. And this photo is actually him. So he hangs out in my garden, but he often comes into the house, presumably through the walls because they're old stone walls. And he hunts under my floorboards and in my ceiling, and I can hear him hunting mice. And so he inspired the character of Mousetrap. Right, so this one isn't my photo. This is a photo by someone called Martin LeMay, and it's a brilliant photo. It's quite a famous photo of a weasel on top of a woodpecker. Now, it looks in the photo like the weasel is riding the woodpecker. Obviously, possibly the weasel might have been attacking the woodpecker at that point, but the idea that a weasel, obviously he is being carried by the woodpecker flying, and I love that idea so much. In my book, I included Mousetrap riding on Blackiston the fish owl, which is one of my favourite scenes, and it was inspired by that photo, basically, of actually seeing a weasel actually riding on a bird, which really happened. So you can see how nature is full of these wonderful, amazing, inspiring events that can inspire you to write stories. And something like a weasel riding an owl sounds completely preposterous, but it is rooted in something that really happened in nature. And I love that. I love that you can go off into nature or read about nature and learn about nature and just discover so many amazing, magical things. It's a source of endless inspiration. Right, so basically, I think that's about it. I think you've got the idea that I had lots of different influences in writing The Girl Who Speaks Bear, and they all came together to create the story. But definitely the strongest influences for me were nature, the outdoors, wildlife, and of course folk tales. But to me, I think folk tales are very much linked with nature. Most old folk stories, often have this forest setting and elements of magic that have come from nature. So, if you would like to write your own stories, I heartily recommend looking for inspiration in those kind of places, in the outdoor world, in wildlife documentaries, in books about nature and wildlife, just getting out there into the wild world, whether it's a small park. Like I say, that photo of Mousetrap, he's just in my garden, which is quite a small patch of grass. But if you sit and you look and you observe, you will find something to inspire you. There are stories all around, and especially in nature. And of course, my folktale influences. I heartily recommend you go and read around some old folk stories as well. There are so many amazing fairy stories and folk story books, and I'm pretty sure there'll be quite a selection in your library, because they are the sorts of stories that endure. So I really hope that you're inspired to create your own stories by looking at older stories and also by getting out into nature. Thank you for listening.